Today's all about Threadlings and answering the questions, are they good and worth using inside of Destiny 2 Renegades? Short answer is yes, assuming you're on Warlock. Today we're going to go over what I consider to be the best Threadling build, as well as quickly touching on a few alternative setups in case any aspects of these other builds get buffed in some way in the future, or you just want to try something different. Before we get into it, if you enjoy or find it helpful, a like and a share goes a long way, as well as subbing if you're new here. What do I consider the best Threadling build right now? It's going to be on Prismatic, using Weaver's Call and unsurprisingly, Devour. And Devour is the big reason as to why this is on Prismatic instead of Strand itself. Strand lacks a dedicated healing source in exchange for damage resistant sources like Woven Mail, and if willing to dedicate a whole aspect slot, Weavewalk. Now that's not to say Weavewalk or Woven Mail are bad, as they are both strong damage resistance options, but fail to compete with the value of Devour. The same can be said for Weaver's Call on Prismatic versus Strand, as Prismatic has access to Phoenix Dive, which, while the overall healing is lower, the burst healing is higher, and the important one, its cooldown is way faster. If this is going to be on Prismatic, what exotics should be used here? I'm using an exotic class item with Spirit of Inmost Light to have more ability uptime, and Spirit of Verity to increase the damage of the Threadling grenade and increase the cooldown rate even further. Though, if you don't have this role on the class item, a regular Verity's Brow will work. So let's talk subclass setup. We're going to be using Needle Storm since this is a Threadling build, but if you wanted to use Song of Flame or even Nova Bomb, it wouldn't be that big a deal. Like mentioned before, we'll be using Phoenix Dive for class ability. For the melee, I'm using Incinerator Snap to get a little more light Transcendence energy, as well as access to Ignitions for some unstop stunning. The grenade will be the Threadling grenade, rather unsurprisingly. Aspects, as mentioned before, will be Devour for healing and grenade regeneration, and Weaver's Call, which now generates Threadlings on damage as well as class ability usage. For fragments, I'm using Protection for the damage resistance, Purpose for some Woven Mail, Hope for more Phoenix Dives, Sacrifice mainly for the plus 10 grenade stats, so feel free to switch it out if you don't need the stats, and then finally Balance for even more ability energy. Let's move on to armor mods. I'll show the mod menu up on screen, but to go over the ones of note real quick, Ashes to Assets for more super energy from your Threadling grenade, Bolstering Detonation for the same reason but for class ability. Strand weapon surges are going to be important in a minute here, but I'm running only one due to energy being taken up here, but if you can fit 2 surges and afford the stat drop, go ahead. Otherwise, fonts to get more stats are normally where I go with almost any build and what I'm running here. Speaking of which, where should your stats go? The most important in my opinion is Grenade, as you will be throwing so many grenades, so you might as well make them deal as much damage as possible. Otherwise, the only stat that I'd put above 100 is Super, but as long as it's at 100 at least, you should be fine. Then both class and weapons are where the rest should go, primarily focusing class. What weapons should you use with this setup? Originally, I had started with Barrow Dyad, using the Hatchling Catalyst, which is still quite a strong exotic primary, but what I believe to be best for this setup is the new Service of Luzaku, the Season Pass exotic alongside Renegades. Why do I consider Service of Luzaku so good here? The amount of Threadlings you can produce with this gun is kind of ridiculous. Assuming you can stay near the Threadling nest during combat, you can keep its health topped off or potentially juggle several Threadling nests and not only flood the field with Threadlings, but also keep your death throw stacks charged at all time. The Threadlings from Service of Luzaku count as weapon damage, which is why they stack death throws, as well as why there's a Strand weapon surge in this setup, which will buff the Threadling damage that spawns from your weapons. Otherwise, I'm using a Mint Retrograde and an Uncivil Discourse, but your legendary weapons are up to you and really don't matter that much. So how do you play this build? It's a fairly simple build, to be honest. Just get Devour up and spam Threadlings from your buffed up Threadling grenades, as well as keep your Threadling nest healthy. Use your Phoenix Dive when you need a quick heal, and pop Transcendence if you reach a point where all of your abilities are on cooldown and your engine is just out of steam. Otherwise, it's just a simple rinse and repeat and kill everything. What about where this build struggles? Mainly in situations where ad density is low or potentially non-existent, like a boss fight after you clear the wave of ads, as well as longer range encounters where your Threadlings don't have the ability to travel far enough and where your Threadling nests from Service of Luzaku are too far away to keep healed up. Thankfully, these sorts of situations aren't very common in the current state of the game. There will be a dim link in the description for this build, as well as the other ones that I'll go over real quick. The first is this weird Getaway Artist version of this build, in which I swapped out Devour for Hellion and started using Getaway Artist with a Storm Grenade, and attempting to activate Devour through artifact perks and the Praxic Blade. And while this build was okay, Devour was almost never active in a team-based game mode, but that wasn't that big of a deal due to the amount of Phoenix Dives that I had, as well as some Void Overshield generation from Facet of Purpose and running Nova Bomb. But This was just worse than a normal getaway artist build with Devour and either Hellion or Bleak Watcher, though shockingly quite effective. And I think probably going to stay in a dim loadout in case it ever became less reliant on Devour, just so it's there. The other setup I tried was a Strand dedicated setup with Verities. Now, this is a bit more of a Verities build than a Threadling build, but oh well. The upsides of this setup is how much damage you're doing with a Verity and Grapple Grenade, but the lack of any dedicated healing source stops this from really being all that effective. The setup isn't bad, but in my opinion falls way behind either the Prismatic Threadling build, or a normal Getaway Artist build, or even the Stormdancer's Brace Arc Warlock build. Linked on screen now, shameless little plug. The other issue with a Warlock Verity setup is that it's simply better on Prismatic Hunter. Using Spirit of Verity and Combination Blow and Stylus Executioner and all these things, which have been nerfed, it still just outputs more damage than being able to do it on Warlock. Finally, let's talk how Threadling setups actually hold up against the rest of the Warlock kit. Overall, in their current state, I'd say it competes with things like Getaway Artists or Stormdancer's Brace, as our kits are so powerful that the differences begin to blur. However, one thing that Threadlings still lack is any potential DPS scenario viability. Currently, Metaiodoxia is quite strong on Warlock because the explosion from the recently buffed, super suspend burst is bugged and will occasionally detonate twice, which is what allows it to do that damage. But the Threadlings are simply not that effective. And things like Euphony are still basically non-existent within the current DPS meta. I think it could be interesting if Euphony were reworked to tie in to that original desire of Strand being this high action per minute gameplay, and somehow translate that into a DPS phase where it may be significantly harder to actually accomplish, but you will be putting out damage rewarding of the effort. Otherwise, I think that's all for today. If you enjoyed, a like and a share would go a long way for a small channel like this one, as well as subscribing and following the Twitch down in the description. And with that said, hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.